Okay, having described what karmic knots are and how ayahuasca and SOMA work to release karmic knots or deeply held emotional patterns and memories in the body-mind, I want to talk about how else we can work with these karmic knots, because plant medicine like ayahuasca and SOMA, it's very helpful. But my view on it's a very powerful practice within a larger view and larger set of practices. It's very human to always want a magic bullet, but nothing's a silver or magic bullet, right? We need to do a number of things, right? From some kind of spiritual practice or just secular meditation to psychotherapy to exercise to yoga to all sorts of things. And so I want to talk about an important kind of meditation practice that's really helpful for working with these karmic knots or deeply held emotional patterns stored in the body when we feel they get triggered. I learned this is an adaptation from one of my teachers, Tsokni Rinpoche, which he calls Handshake practice. What it invites us to do is to connect the thinking mind and the feeling mind. The body and mind are one thing, and thinking and feeling are both important parts of consciousness and important parts of being a human being and sense making. Yet, and the more educated we are, the more of a habit we have, we can be very analytical and used to going into analyzing things and going into the story. And we hope, this is a very human thing, I think we think that if we just had the right story, we would get ourselves out of the prison of thought that we're in. But a lot of times we're not going to get out of a prison of thought through more thought. And thought is actually the response to often an anxious response, something being triggered in the body. So first thing we can do is when we notice that a strong emotion has come up, and if we notice there's thinking, which there often is in general, but in response to something being triggered, just notice there's a thought or notice the story. It might even be helpful. You can just label it thinking to kind of put a picture frame around it. But first thing we do is just recognize there's thinking and just drop the thinking. You can even do, if it helps, to raise your hands up and just exhaling, blowing thoughts out, releasing thoughts into space. As you let attention drop down into the body, allow it to go wherever the feeling is. So get curious around where that is. So for example, if you notice that there's sadness, or if you notice that there's anger or anxiety, get curious about that. If it's not immediately obvious, you might ask yourself the question, where in the body am I feeling anger? Or where in the body am I feeling sadness? And bring curiosity to that question. It's not about going into more thinking in response to that question. The question itself is a way to open the body-mind into inquiry and to make it more receptive and to feel or sense your way into that question. And the more we get into this habit, I found personally the easier it is to dial into that emotion and to just be with that contraction in the body. And it's often a contraction, right? If we're feeling something like love, joy, or compassion, it's not a kind of, or kindness towards someone else, that's not a kind of contraction around an object. It often feels very expansive. But if we're feeling some kind of acute, I hesitate to use the word negative emotion, that's often used because I think all emotions are instructive. And so that's important to view it that way. But these kind of challenging emotions often feel like a kind of contraction in the body mind, and it often, in my experience, can feel like being as if you're very separate, cut off, alone. A lot of times we don't feel connected, even when it's something like grief, like losing someone. That's a deeply human emotion. It's part of the human condition, but sometimes it can feel like my grief or like I'm the only one going through this, which can make it worse. So that's part of a story, for example. So just if you felt grief, just letting attention be in the body with it, and just relaxing into it and fully allowing experience to take place freely. When I say relax into it, it doesn't mean that you're supposed to enjoy it or tell yourself a story that you enjoy it or wish that this thing had happened. It just means you're not resisting it, because there's already some kind of pain or suffering going on, but we don't need to we don't need to place a second layer of suffering on top of it through our resistance to it. So we're just being with the feeling in the body. We're not resisting it, but we're not indulging it either. We're not getting swept away by the story. We're not trying to amplify it and make it worse. We're just being with it, completely opening to it. And so that's a really just sort of basic way, get in the habit of starting to work with the karmic knots. There's a really good meditation practice called RAIN that Tara Brach has made popular, so you can check that out. I've got one as well, but that is a similar practice to Handshake practice, where it's about noticing the story that's going on in the cognitive mind, the analytical mind, but then just dropping the story and being with the body. So that's the important thing with the karmic knots, is really just dropping the story, being in the body, connecting the thinking mind and the feeling mind. It's through that connection of the thinking and feeling mind that we invite greater embodiment, and that we're going to allow the process of energy to move freely through the body and to come into a more relaxed, balanced, open state of mind.